but we're going to have to go quite quickly through this next part, is what's happening here. What do we do with that? And there's an interesting thing with the trace elements, that when we look at the hardness of the elements, as we go through the periodic table of elements this way, they're becoming increasingly large and they become increasingly hard and dense. And there's things like their melting points and all that sort of stuff. And that carries on quite happily until this point here, when all of a sudden we actually have to jump over to zinc here for our hardness, and it runs this way, and then it comes back here and carries on until we do the same again. So there's this very interesting odd thing in the structure of the periodic table that says it makes a lot of sense if when we look at the trace elements that we grab them here and we pull them and twist them over. So we lemniscate them because we've moved into life now. We're dealing with biological elements. We can lemniscate them, and so we come like this in our process of elements. And just as Rudolf Steiner does in the 12 senses, it's the same process. And so we look at the structure there, and we can start to see that if we follow that path, we can see how these are more etheric and these are more physical. And if we read Hauschka and other writers, they will tell you the story of how this increasing density manifests in a scientific way. So at the same time, we can start to bring planetary references that we have into these elements, and that's done by some of these writers. And so the main point of this is that we're building up cross-references on these elements. We're getting all these ways that we can look at these things. And so in the building up of that cross-reference, we're gaining information and insight into them. We can do the same process with the lactanoids and actinoids. Now, the interesting thing is that really we're dealing with a three-dimensional structure. So we should be able to make a spherical three-dimensional structure out of the periodic table. We've got 3 groups of elements. And what's important to acknowledge is that there's 8 of those, 10 of those, 14 of those. So from a musical context, this is the 4th harmonic, this is the 5th harmonic, and this is the 7th harmonic.
Thank you.
And so that they are different. They're dimensionally different. And as we have these 3, within a 3-dimensional being, there's 3 planes. So the question comes, we've got 3 of those, we've got 3 planes, so which one's which? Which plane are we going to put where? And so we can say, okay, the major elements are going to be our first vertical axis, and that just leaves these 2. So which one are we going to put on the horizontal plane? Now, for that question, or the answer, we can say these are the elements involved in biological processes. So they're the elements involved in life. So where do we find life? And if you think back in our pictures, back to the galaxy, remember it was the flat plane that we found on the solar system. It's on the flat plane that we find the Earth. So why not put the biological elements on the flat plane? Which means there's only one plane left, which is that one there. Therefore, it leads to this thing here. That this is a 3-dimensional periodic table. And that's it. Now, of course, we can just 2-dimensional those again. So there's the 3-dimensional periodic table. And we have this one from the rings, so that we can identify these energetic activities. But we can go a little bit further here and start to look at what happens with this 3-dimensional being once we look at it from this perspective. Now, Rudolf Steiner has written about the sphere and being forwards and backwards and up and down and left and right. So there's a literature around that, and that all conforms into this picture as well. So we can start to identify these parts. As I say, we're a bit short on time, and there's something I really want to show you. So this is what happens when we two-dimensional all of those on top of one another. And so here we can start to see relationships between the major elements, minor elements. But the real big kicker here is once we've got a circle, we've actually got polarity activities taking place. And so we can start to see relationships in this chart that we can't see in the rectangular periodic table. And a big one I'd like to indicate is these guys, potassium to phosphorus. And if you've got phosphorus lock up on your farm, have a look and see what your potassium's doing. And if you deal to your potassium, you'll find your phosphorus will become available. So there's all sorts of these polaric activities that we can start to identify. And things like the boron-fluoride relationship that's necessary to activate silica, for example. These things start to show up. But wait, there's more. This is where I've been able to put the relationships of the constellations and the various planetary activities onto this in regards to Leavegood, which gives us more references that we can use, and I wish we had time to go through all this. However, there's one more part to this which Rudolf Steiner brings out, is when we were talking about what are the relationships of these elements to the activities, as Rudolf Steiner points out, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen and carbon. And so we can look at it this way. So far, we've identified the... can I just borrow this, please? So far, we've identified it according to the rings, and we've according to these arms. And so, in the process of manifestation, we go through 3 stages. A cell will be a cell, it'll then start to pulsate, and then it'll divide. So we've got 3 stages to manifestation. We then move into the lemniscate, and then we enfold into the physical matter. So far, we've got what is, we've got what happens when it moves, so what is behind manifestation, and now we're going to look at manifestation. And that's what Rudolf Steiner tells us. He tells us that these are the elements that anchor these energetic activities into the physical reality. So if we look at the carbon, nitrogen, oxygen arms and the hydrogen arm, we identify that we have cations and anions. So we have a positive and a negative process that's taking place that we can identify and work with as a manifest plane of the activity of the elements. So it's just another layer that we can identify. So we have this 3-stage process that we can then put together into this diagram here. Now, this is just a process that I've done where you then just line up all your reference systems. And so for the major elements, we've got all the scientific data that we can accumulate. We can identify Steiner's arm as being etheric, and then the gyroscopic arm layer, the name from the agriculture course, the spiritual activity that's taking place. And then, of course, we can go and look at all the scientific information. Look up a website that tells you what chemistry says about the nature of this thing, because that's all part of your phenomenological study. And then go to homeopathy and see what homeopathy is saying about this thing. And so there's all this reference that we can use to gain this understanding of these elements.